Okay, good morning. We continue the review summary of the conclusion of Ayin Beis, Volume 3. And we're in the middle of understanding different levels of Kudsha Brich Hu and Shecinta, and we're up to page 1439. So we've gone through Yichud Kudsha Brich Hu Shecinta Adreim HaMailas, to the highest levels, like I elaborated on the previous class. That's essentially on every level, we want to introduce those levels of unity. And so we discussed Zah and Malchus, began with Malchus of Atzilus, both Malchus of Atzilus as it enters Biyah, Malchus of Atzilus as in Atzilus, then Bina and Zah, Chachma and Bina, Arich, or Malchus of Keser, of Arich Ampin and Chachma, and then in Keser itself, Malchus of Arich is Shechina compared to the Midas Lamayla, the Midas Atzmim, as he called it, higher than Chachmas Tema, is Kudsha Brich Hu. And finally, in general, that's all in Arich. Arich and Atik. That's what we learned, the last thing we learned. Atik and Arich, both of them, though they're two different levels in Keser, but they both have this paradoxical element. Like he said, they're made up of two words that reflect two extremes. Atik Yemen, on one hand, Atik means Hataka, removed. Yemen means structure. The Hamshacha, like he said, the Zayin Tachtenis, Yem Gilui. And Arich Ampin, on one hand, Ampin is face. A face is a pnimius, as he said, structure. And Arich Ampin, Arich reflects a long face, which means an element of bligvul. So these two, Arich and Atik, also serve as he said, as being Kudsha Brich Hu and Shecinta. Well, the other way order. Atik being Kudsha Brich Hu, Arich being Shecinta. And the goal is to be mamshich into structure, that which is beyond structure. Like he said, with Meya Shana, his slapshus Atik ba'arich, that Arich Ampin should be Shana Loshen Yachid, even though it's Meya. Meya means a number 100, means there's a structure of 100, 10 times 10. And yet there should be the Antu Chad. So bottom line is, we have here a blueprint for whatever level you're on. There's a Yichud Kudsha Brich Hu Shecinta that corresponds to that level. And essentially it's climbing higher and higher. Obviously, when it comes to real Aveda, each of us has to spell this out in a way that we relate to, which we really didn't discuss. That's already a personal tailoring of these ideas in a Chassidus applied manner. But the concepts are here, and as I said, he keeps climbing higher and higher. We're going to go even higher now into the world of Adam Kadman. So that's where we'll continue now. And this probably deserves its own new paragraph. We're talking now 3, 6, 8 lines from the top of page 1439. The line that begins, the Al Yedei Slapshus Atik, the end of the line, Ulamaila. So let's continue learning now inside. The pages can be found at ayinbeis.com. It says, Ulamaila Mizeh. Higher than what? Higher than Atik and Arich. We have Kudsha Brich Hu Shecinta, even a higher level now. And what's the higher level? B'chinas Malchus da'ak gam ken nikra Shechina. Since we've already established that Malchus in every level apparently is the level of Shechina, Malchus of Arich, Malchus of Atzilus, because Malchus is the lowest sphere that channels the higher spheres into the lower level, so it's called Shechina. So now Malchus of Ak, Adam Kadman, which is the first world that was created after the Kav, after the Tzimtzum and the Kav, Ak, Adam Kadman, called the primordial man, which is sometimes called Ur Klali by the Magid. It's like the bird's eye view, the whole blueprint of all of existence. Whereas the lower worlds already are more structured. Ak is that first snapshot, if you wish, of everything. It includes everything. So there's an Ak itself, Malchus of Ak. Now here too, these are just words, technical words. But each level, it's not just a play of words, Malchus of Ak. Obviously, you can understand this to be far more sublime and more subtle. Like I've given the example a number of times of the development of a fetus. Why? Because I wanted to give an example we all can relate to, where you see different stages of development. When there's one cell that was conceived, it's only one cell, and it's minuscule. That cell will split into two, and then into four, into eight, ultimately be trillions of cells which comprise a human being, and all life for that matter. It's just an example that the same as Seder Shtalshalos. So you talk about Ak, you're talking about a very high level of creation, very early stage in development. When you're talking Atzilus, it's still a very spiritual and a godly world, but it's not as sublime. So comparatively speaking, you could say Akudim is 10 energies in one container. Ak is even higher than that. Sometimes it says Ak doesn't even have containers. I apologize for my hoarseness. I have a little cold. So I hope my voice, the ideas and the words are coming through. Okay. So l'mayla b'zeh b'chinas malchus the Ak gam kein nikra Shechina. It's also called Shechina, again relative to that which is higher than malchus of Ak. Va'inyanu, and what's the inyan in this? So he says, Kamesh Kosav, Bezeya Yisrei, Daf Samach Zayin Amid Aleph. In the footnote, they say maybe it should say Samach Zayin Amid Beis. I guess when you look inside the Zohar, so it's referring to Isaiah Yisrei 67b. Is Melech Le'ela Beroza de Kedesh HaKadoshim. So again, the Rebbe Rashab is grounding this level, the real source in Zohar. There's a melech le'ela, melech meaning a malchus, a level of malchus above, but also the Kedesh HaKadoshim, meaning in the secret chambers of the Holy of Holies. Upirish HaRamaz, and the Ramaz, Rav Moshe Zekuto, a commentary based on the Torah of the Arizal, explains the Zohar, Shezel B'chinas Malchus the Ak. But the Zohar, which is very cryptic, Malchus, Melech Le'ela Beroza the Kedesh HaKadoshim, says referring to Malchus of Ak. So he's established this level. The Nikla Melech Mipnei Shemekabeles Mipchinas Ein Sof. And why is it called a Melech? Because it receives from Ein Sof. Hainu B'chinas Ak Shenikra Ein Sof. Because Malchus of Ak, which is like the lowest level in Ak, where is it receiving its energy? We know Malchus doesn't have anything of its own, less Lamagamokhlum, like the moon. So just like in Atzilus, Malchus of Atzilus receives from the higher spheres in Atzilus, Malchus of Ak receives from the Ein Sof, which is Ak itself. So the Ein Sof of Ak is channeling through Malchus. Commission is barely ill. Umashpes ben Natzalim. And when Malchus receives that, then what does it do with it? It transmits that to the emanations that are lower level of Atzilus ultimately. But this is higher than Keser. This is the level of Ak. Commission is barely ill, like we learned earlier, Dibra Malchus Kisavoyu V'Shavsa. So in the footnote below, he says, this is on in volume 2, page 979. Okay. So what do we have? Malchus Avak, which receives from Ein Sof Avak is Shechina. And what's Kudsha Brich Hu on this level? The Kudsha Brich Hu, the Atzmi Sak rather, and the core, like we've been learning till now, there's the core and there's its extension. The Atzmi Savak, Hu B'chinas Kudsha Brich Hu. That's the level of Kudsha Brich Hu. So now we've moved Kudsha Brich Hu and Shecinta to an even higher level in Ak itself. And bottom line again, every level has a level that relates to the lower levels and a level that's higher and removed from the lower levels. Kudsha Brich Hu from the word Kodesh, Kodesh and Muvdal, and Malchus from the word Shechina, from the word Shechenes or Mislabeshes, that manifests v'ithin. We can say, V'shachanti b'seicham, I will rest among you. That's already a manifestation. V'ayin mashakosav be'sofes teira eir. So he's now referring to something we learned earlier. You may recall when he spoke about, trying to remember where it was, Istako Baraisa Bara Alma. I think it was page, let me see, 1406, I believe. Yeah. Yeah. So he said like this. Look in the surface of Torah Air, that's the Alter Rebbe's Maimer, obviously. Babir Devanino Sati, in the Bir Vanino Sati, what does he say there? So there he talks about the difference in Atzmis Avak and the extension of Malchus Avak. V'ayin Lufi Mashakosa b'Mishnah Chesidim, Mesechta Klolos Ha'elmis Reish Perek Beis. So there's a rule, there's a Mishnah Chesidim, we referred to it yesterday. Emmanuel Chai Reiki. In the Masechta called Klolos Ha'elmis, beginning of chapter 2, the Akub Chinis Arich, the Klolos Ha'elmis. In the macrocosm, so Arich, we know in the microcosm is the Arich of Keser, the lower level of Keser, that we were talking before about, Arich Hampin, and its Malchus is the Shechina that relates to Atzilus. So Mishnah Chesidim, he says that Ak in general is the Arich of all of Klolos Elmas, of the whole Seder Shtalshlus. So that's now going to be consistent with Kudsha Brich Hu Shecinta that we learned earlier in Arich. So he says that's okay. So according to what he says there, Yesh Leimer, the Klolos B'chinasaku B'china Shechina. Because like we said before, that Arich, well, at least Malchus of Arich, and later compared to Atik, he said Arich is Shechina. So since Ak is the macrocosmic Arich, so you could say all of Ak, not just Malchus of Ak, is like the Shechina. Like we learned earlier that Arich is the Nefesh of Atzilus. So the same thing, Klolos B'chinas Ak is the Shechina, canal. V'hainu B'chinas Chitzenius Ak. That's the outer dimension of Ak. So he's explaining it a bit differently. First he said was Malchus of Ak, and then there's the Atzmis of Ak, Shechina and Kudsha Brich Hu. Now he's saying Chitzenius of general Ak is Arich Shechina. That's the primordial thought where God has, like I said before, a snapshot, like a bird's eye view of the entire panorama of existence. And is their root and source. That's Shechina. But Kudsha Brich Hu b'chinas Pnimius Ak. And Kudsha Brich Hu is Pnimius Ak. So in this context, the outer dimension relates to existence and engages with it, and Pnimius Ak remains removed. That's this higher level of Kudsha Brich Hu and Shechina. We learned this, as I said earlier, page 1406, that the Eibush Hashem looks Kudsha Brich Hu. So you see the word Kudsha Brich Hu, looks into the Torah, and with that he creates existence. That Torah begins Chitzenius Ak, we learned. And Kudsha Brich Hu would be Pnimius Ak. Or as he says now, the Kudsha Brich Hu b'chinas hakav hamislabish ba'ak. Shezeh b'chinas Pnimius Ak. So remember, after the Tzimtzum comes the kav. That's the first ray of light, so to speak, which with the light that comes after the Tzimtzum to create everything. That kav, he's now saying, creates Ak. So the kav itself is like Pnimius Ak, and Chitzenius Ak is Torah, which the Kudsha Brich Hu looks into, because it's already a blueprint that talks about what the existence should be like Yehi Oir, Vayemer Elikim Yehi Oir. That's already the Torah as it associates with existence. So it's Chitzenius Ak, Shechina, And Kudsha Brich Hu would be the higher level of Pnimius Ak. The Kav, the Mislabish Ba'ak, which is Pnimius Ak.
Are you saying there's two levels of Pnimius Ak?
Let me just finish and then I'll, 1 second, let me just finish. Gam Yesh Lemer, you could also say, Shezeh B'chinas Atik Da'ak. We could also say this higher level is the Atik of Ak, which is consistent with what he said before with Arich and Atik in the microcosm. So the Atik of Ak, Meshikosa Beitz Chaim, I mentioned this yesterday, Shar Ches, Perikei, Sheyesh Kedugmas Atik Le'elam Ugulgalta Delay. There's like a similar dimension, like Atik, like the Atik of Atzilus. There's something similar above the crown, the skull of Ak. So that would be the higher level called Kudsha Brich Hu. That's the beginning of the Kav. Shenasa b'chinas Atik la'ak. That becomes the level of Atik to Ak. And that's the level of Kudsha Brich Hu. To sum up, just like he spoke before, first he said Malchus of Arich is Shechina, and the Midas of Arich is Kudsha Brich Hu. Then he went higher and said Arich in general is Shechina, and Atik is Kudsha Brich Hu. So in Ak, Adam Kadmon itself, the Rebbe Rashab, I count 3 different ways to explain it. One is Malchus of Ak is Shechina, what he called Melech Le'ela, Malchus of Ak. Then there's the Atzmius of Ak is Kudsha Brich Hu, the core of Ak. The second thing he said was Ak in general is Arich. So Chetzenius Ak is Shechina, and Pnimius Ak, which is the Kav that radiates within Ak, is the Kudsha Brich Hu. And finally, he's saying that Atik of Ak is Kudsha Brich Hu, and all the other levels of Ak is Shechina. Those are 3 different ways he explains in Ak itself these 2 levels of Kudsha Brich Hu and Shechina. Okay. Now, he doesn't explain this in Avodah. He doesn't explain to us what's the difference between these levels. He's just pointing out that in each level you have these 2 levels. That's no, as I said, that would require personalizing it. What does it mean to each one of us, these different levels? But suffice it to say, like we discussed, everybody, as they climb in their journey, has me'in, has a similarity of this, some type of, in some subtle form, all these levels. Yes, for many of us, it's just going from Malchus to Zah is good enough. Or even lower, from Malchus of Asiya to Zah of Asiya is also a Kudsha Brich Hu and Shechina. But nevertheless, the Rebbe Rashab is being thorough, giving us the whole blueprint, the whole map. You can say, like I said, the stepping stones. So we have a whole bunch of levels here, Kudsha Brich Hu and Shechina, and this is all after the Tzimtzum. He's gotten out to the highest level, the Kav, being Kudsha Brich Hu, and then Chetzenius Ak, or everything below Atik of Ak, being Shechina. That's as far as we've reached there. So before we continue, if there are any questions, please.
Yes, I had a question if no one else does. You introduced Ak by saying, I think you said called it it's an or klali or
that's what the Maggid calls it, or klali. It's like the
all-encompassing light.
The whole Seder Shtalshlus.
Right. So if it's klali in its nature, and I understand maybe he doesn't mean it that way. How does one understand it and it as having parts? If it's klali, if it has pshitas, how can it have parts?
So I gave the example. How does one cell, upon conception, does it have parts? You have to think. You
conceptually
can't think in linear terms. Everything relative to lower levels seems to be what you call pshitas, seamless. But when you put it under a microscope, you'll find details there too.
Thank you. Is it fair to say that I'm trying to relate this in Balabhatisha terms to understand it in my own meaning, like you urge us to. Is it fair to say that this sort of Atik of Ak is the Ratzon of Hashem, like what he wants to do with the
That's
Kav?
Arich. Arich is the Ratzon. Atik is associated with Tainug, pleasure.
Ah, interesting. Okay. So if it's associated with Tainug, it can't have a Ratzon per se. I mean, you can have a Ratzon,
Well,
but not a,
it's all relative. If you're
yes.
talking, Ratzon itself could also have Shechina and Kudsha Brich Hu, or Ratzon is Shechina and Tainug,
Tainug.
Atik is Kudsha Brich Hu.
Yes. Very good. Thank you.
It's all relative. It's all relative.
Yes, yes, yes.
Look, you know, just to use a scientific example, they do stem cell research. You know, when a person has an issue, you can find a remedy that's on a very surface level that deals with the symptoms. But there are times you want to go deeper into the root of an issue, and you have to dig deeper, and sometimes you need surgery, God forbid. I mean, basically, God should protect us all, and you need to go deep, dig deeper. So the same is the idea here. Everything in existence begins on a surface level, but when you start dissecting it, its engineering has all kinds of forces. That's why I always give the example of the elements of this world, which really make up everything that exists, is made up of elements, the elementary table. The elements are made up of molecules, and molecules of atomic and subatomic, and you keep going down the rabbit hole. So the same idea, and how much more so in Ruchnis, that you're dealing with as you go deeper, or you go backwards, if you wish, you're going back to the original primordial state, hence Adam Kadmon, where everything is in a very concentrated form. In a way, when the scientists talk about the Big Bang, and they look at their satellites to see what was happening however they time it, they're looking at something that is millions of light years away from us, because they want to see what was going on in those earlier stages. So it's just another example of going back to retracing the steps. In Avodah, this is more of a spiritual journey and a psychological journey. I mean, no different than if a person, let's say, is dealing with anger. We mentioned anger. Or dealing with depression, or dealing with other challenges. So you could trace the causes of it. The ostensible causes, you can trace them to some extent. But if you start digging, you can find a very deep trauma that happened that a person may not even be aware of and not even remember, but it's in their body. The body holds score, as they say. The body has memories. So it could be embedded deep in our psyches. Just using it as an example. So in a way, when you're talking about real avodas Hashem, you don't just want to connect to God on the outer levels. Like, for example, in the morning you say, Modani, thank you for returning my soul to me. Then you say, Neshama shenesata bi tahirihi, ata barasa, ata yitzata, ata nefachta bi, ata meshamra b'kirbi. Right there, you've spelled out 4 or 5 even, 4 levels, deeper levels of your soul. Because you don't just want to say, okay, God, thank you for giving me a soul, giving me life. Thank you for the blessings, the food you give me, the health, the parnasa, my family. That's for sure. That's an acknowledgement of the God's blessings on that level. But when you start climbing, you're going deeper, and you want a deeper relationship with God, deeper levels of Kudsha Brich Hu and Shechina, as they manifest, that's what we're... So the only way to really do this in a practical, what we call applied chassidus, is to sit with a mashpia, or yourself, or with a friend, and say, okay, how could I identify in my own life the difference between Zah and Malchus, between Bina and Zah, Chachma and Bina, Arich and Chachma, Atik and Arich, and I'm not even mentioning them all. Ak, Chetzeni Yisak, Malchus Avak, Chetzeni Yisak, Primi Yisak. So I'm deliberately not doing that here because it's a whole class of its own, And I'm right now focusing on just getting the so-called the facts down, as the Rebbe Rashab is explaining them. And then there's, of course, applying that. That's the main, that's when you really learn to appreciate it. That's why I'm stating that. But I'm not going there because it reserves its own. Sometimes I'll go there. There'll be times we go there. Right now, I'd rather move along because I want to get back to the main theme of the Ramach, the 248 mitzvahs and 248 words in Shema that create this achdus, because that's what it comes down to. I will say this: you don't have to make yourself crazy to try to find all these levels within you. In Aveda, you always, don't bite off more than you can chew. Tefasta meruba lo tefasta. If in today's saying Shema, Hashem Echad, you can find some fragmentation in your life, and you can identify so-called the divine energy in that fragmentation, and then connect it to Kudsha Brich Hu, to the divine unity, you will have done a very good job. I would say that's a success. Because that's how you begin. You begin by finding somewhere where you can apply Yichud Kudsha Brich Hu Shecinta Hashem Echad in your area in your life. Whether this is Zohar Malchus or it's Chachma Bina, I'm talking now as a mashpia, not learning the ideas. I would say, let's begin with something. It's like when you tell students in a class, I want to say we're going to now swim a marathon of 20 miles. Let's begin 1 lap, 2 laps, and start getting acclimated. And as we get used to that, then you can expand and condition yourself and grow in the Yichud Kudsha Brich Hu Shecinta. That's just practical advice. Am I being understood? I feel that I'm getting hoarser and hoarser. I don't know. I have a bad cold.
You're coming across more than clearly enough. Yeah. Sorry you're stretching it, but we hear you fine.
Okay, good. Are there any other questions? Okay, let's continue then. Actually, when we did the essay contest a few years ago, so one of my intentions was like, you can take this mimer and all these levels, and the challenge would be, can you apply them in life? How would you apply Zohar Malchus, Kudsha Brich Hu Shecinta on a lower level, on a higher level? Okay. Now, we're going to go even higher. We're going to go all the way in the levels of the Kav. So far, we've reached the highest level we've reached was the Kav, right? The Kav is Kudsha Brich Hu. The Kav manifests in Atik of Ak, or Pnimius Ak, and higher Atik of Ak. So that's where we stopped. So the Kudsha Brich Hu would be the Kav. Now we're going to learn that the Kav actually can also be referred to as Shechina. And here too, I refer you back to the Maimer Bas Legani, Tafshin Yudal, 1951. The Rebbe actually spoke about this, as I mentioned. He spoke of the different levels of Shechina. Omnam B'chlolus, new paragraph. Okay, however, after everything that was said and done, after everything we discussed about the different levels of Shechina and Kudsha Brich Hu, B'chlolus in the B'chinas ha'er shenimshach be'elamis, hainu B'chinas ha'kav. In general terms, if you really broaden the picture now, that the oir that manifests, and in the olamis, which is the kav. Remember, the kav is a thin line. It's very intense and very powerful, and it's higher than all the worlds. But it's still a kav. It's not Ein Sof before the Tzimtzum. The Tzimtzum concealed everything, and then came a kav kotzer v'dak, a kav v'chut. We call a line and a thread. Think of it like a laser beam, like we talked about a paintbrush. Shenimshach me'ein sof nikra gam ke'shchina. So if you think about it, relatively speaking, the kav, yes, compared to Ak, to that which is lower than it, it's Kudsha Brich Hu. But compared to higher than it, the Ein Sof, it's called Shechina. Ki shem Shechina, hu al shem sheshechin u'mislabish b'shalamata b'menu. like we learned earlier, Shechina comes from a meaning. It means something that resides, that dwells, and mislabish, and manifests, and gets enclosed in a level lower than it. Kudsha Brich Hu is Kadesh, umuvdal, removed. But Shechina, wherever level it is talking about manifesting. Which means Vahainu. So Shechina immediately means that you're connecting to a level that is relatively lower than the original level. That's separate from it, muvdelas. That's what Shechina is. It's coming down, Shechenes u'mislabeshes. When the Eibishter says, V'aseh l'migdash, v'shechanti b'seicham, that's a chiddush. Because before that, the divine was everywhere. Well, let me correct myself. The divine is always everywhere. But the Eibishter said, here's a mishkan where I will focus my energy. Tzimtzum Shecinta Beishnei Badei Ha'aron, the expression is sometimes, where the energy is like focused and channeled between the two rods of the ark, or in general in the Mishkan. You say v'shachanti b'seicham. You don't say v'shachanti elsewhere. Now that means that, of course, Shamayim v'aretz animale, HaKadosh Baruch Hu obviously is everywhere. But there's something, the Shechina, in additional presence. It's like we say the Shechina rests on the Kaisel HaMaravi. The Rambam says, because Kedusha Lezazim Imkema. The Shechina is everywhere. But Shechina refers to a level that's associating with something more specific. So that's Muvdelas Be'erech. And since we're talking that the Kav is already a divine energy that's associating with existence, in that context it would be also called Shechina. Dihine, and he explains, B'slapshus ha'partzufim zeh b'zeh b'madregas atzilus. Partzufim is a structure. When you say a partzuf, like a face. So there's in Kabbalah we talk about nekuda, sfira, partzuf. Nekuda is a dot. It's like an artist. You begin with a dot. Sfira is a full-blown attribute, chesed. Partzuf is a combination of several attributes. So when you say a face, for example, talk about arich ampin or zoir ampin, a face is not just a nose, eyes, a mouth, it's all of the above. So in partzufim, you could say Zah is a partzuf, Zah, because it consists of 6 midas. Chachma and Bina is a partzuf. Keser is a partzuf, because it has Atik and Arich. So he says, when the partzufim are interacting with each other, let's say Moichin and Mides, Chachma, Bina, and Zah, but Madregas Atzilus, Ein Zeh Nikra Shechina. You don't call that Shechina, because they're commensurate to each other. Shechina indicates a leap, that something is on a higher level, and then it manifests in a way that now it's resting and residing and dwelling in a lower level. Rak b'slapshus habina b'zah. One second.
Hina b'slapshus ha'partzufim zeh b'zeh b'madregas atzilus. Ein zeh nikra Shechina le'yosha zehem ba'erech.
I just read that.
Yeah, rak b'slapshus. Sorry.
No, okay, before we go to the next line, I need to give an introduction. Because what he wants to say here, basically, is that Shechina indicates some type of a leap. That's why it's not called Kudsha Brich Hu, it's called Shechina. Because Shechina is how the divine relates to the lower level. So he's qualifying here that you don't say that on every level. When Chachma, for example, goes into Bina, you don't necessarily call it Shechina. But on the other hand, we did learn earlier, if you remember, he said that Zah is like, Bina he called, was Shechina compared to Chachma. He said that on page 1436. And Zah he called Shechina compared to Bina. So he wants to qualify and explain what he meant by that. So But the key point he wants to make here is that Shechina always refers to, 1 second, please. My phone started acting up here. 1 second.
Didn't he say that Zah of Atzilus skipped past Chachma of Atzilus and was mushrish in Arich, and that was the Kudsha Brich Hu?
Yeah.
That's what he's coming to qualify now. He's coming to explain this. Okay. So the first thing he's saying is that Shechina is reserved when you're taking a higher level, and you're, like he said, mislabish b'shalamata memenu. Like the Mishkan is a perfect example. They built a sanctuary, and now v'shachanti b'seichem, the Shechina rests there. Tafke the Shechina. Higher levels of Elokus are everywhere. But here you have a special manifestation of godliness in the Mishkan. The same thing with the Beis Hamikdash. Whereas levels that are more commensurate to each other, he's saying you wouldn't call that Shechina. Like Patzufim, Islapshus Patzufim Zeh B'Zeh. But before he did say, as I just asked, that Zah compared to Bina, he called Shechina. So he's qualifying that in the next section here. So he says, Rak by Islapshus Habina B'Zah. It's only when Bina manifests in Zah. Bina is the seichel that manifests in the midas. Li is the Zah Gamkein b'chinas avdolas erech l'gabe b'chinas Bina, because Zah is somewhat of a leap compared to Bina, u'kamei amidas l'gabe hamechet, like emotions in general compared to intellect, compared to the cognitive. The meichin heim la'atzmei u'midas el azulas. Meichin is something you engage in on your own, not with other people. You're learning something on your own. And midas is predicated on a relationship with others. Zulas. V'chol inyan midas hu argoshas atzmei. Seichel is not about you. It's about the idea. The objectivity of the objective idea. Midas is argoshas atzmei. Commission is barlil, as we learned earlier. Al kein nikra bina shechina. That's why Bina is called Shechina, because there is Havdalah Se'erech. And we learned earlier that's the level of higher Shechina. The lower Shechina is Malchus. And Bina is the Shechinti Ilah. The Makom Mokim Einze b'madregen Ivdelas Mamish. And yet, you can't really say Bina is completely removed. Shari Akol, Hu Atzilus. Because both Bina and Zah, they're both in Atzilus. So it's all relative. In that relative state, you can call Bina Shechina compared to lower levels. But the Ikka Shem Shechina, the primary, even though we spoke Shechina on all the levels, the primary place we use the word Shechina is on Malchus. Ubchinas Malchus, Hashem Shechenas B'Biyah. Because Malchus manifests in Biyah, Shenivl Be'erech Ma'atzilus. So he's basically saying that though we use Shechina, relatively speaking, in Atzilus itself, but Shechina is primarily used. The main place of Shechina is when you're dealing with a leap, Atzilus to Biyah. So Malchus is called Shechina because it's a leap before it goes into Biyah. Shezet tzarich liyas ayidei tzimtzum v'helam, because that requires a concealment, a tzimtzum, a diminishment and a concealment. V'hu inyan b'kiyas aparsa, that's the piercing of the curtain, the partition between Atzilus and Biyah, shebein Atzilus l'Biyah. That's what causes Malchus, this Tzimtzum and Helam, to go down into Bria and be called the head of Bria, which is removed from it being the last level of Atzilus. That's what's called Shechina, because there's a leap involved. So he's basically qualifying and saying, yes, in more subtle ways, you can call Shechina anytime something is different than another level, but the main place you would use it is the bigger the leap, the more you could use the word Shechina, because it requires this jump from one state to another state. And additionally, because in addition to the leap, the oyer is fundamentally shaped in order to radiate and to descend in tachtenim. In other words, Malchus prepares the oyer to be received in the kelim of Biyah. So all that indicates why it's called Shechina. So now he's going to go back to the Kav. So now, based on this logic, how about the Kav after the Tzimtzum? So yeah, compared to lower levels, obviously it's a high level, Kudsha Brich Hu, but compared to the Ur before the Tzimtzum, and the same thing, the Hamshach and Atzilus from Erein Sof is called Shechina, like we discussed earlier, because relative to higher level, it's a leap. Okay, here he brings it explicitly, like the pasuk says, "And I will dwell among you," which is referring within the soul, within the person, within every individual. That's called a Shechina. That's called Shechina, because you're taking a level that's a higher level, and you're so-called channeling it into a lower level. That though it says that a person is called Adam Adam Elyon, similar to above, because we're created in the divine image. Im kol zeh rak Adam Elyon. Levad. V'lo kamay Elyon kavyachol. It's only similar to that which is above, but it's not what is above actually. It's a similarity. It's like a likeness. In order for Erein Sof, which is without any limits and without any end, that should radiate in the souls of Israel, which should manifest in bodies that are finite. That cannot happen without a tzimtzum. Like he says here, I mentioned that before. Like taking the Shechina and focusing it that it should be found in the two rods on the ark where Hashem spoke to Moshe Rabbeinu. Let me just finish. In order for there to be revelation in a confined and defined place, that required tzimtzum. That's what turns it into Shechina. So similarly, for the Gili to come into Neshamas Yisrael, they're just similar to above, but they're not what's above, because they're finite and limited, especially as they manifest in a finite body. Al Kain, you need the tzimtzum, and therefore, and that's ultimately the meaning of Shechina, that the that does reside there is an that was subject to concealment and being channeled into this particular location, this area, and that's called Shechina. So what he's given us here is a deeper understanding of what the word Shechina means. Then you can go back to all the levels he discussed, and you can realize that yes, every lower level is called Shechina because it's relating to the levels below it. When we said Malchus of Arich, is because that becomes the Reish L'Netzolim, that becomes the beginning of the emanations. Same thing, Malchus of Ak, etc. V'chein agili b'atzilus, and so too the revelation in Atzilus. Shenikra Adam, Hashem Adal Ne'el Kaneda. Next page, 1440. That is called Adam. We know Atzilus is called Adam because it's similar, like a reflection of the divine above Atzilus. The Mekom Okum Rab Chinas Adama Levad. It's still Dama. Adama means only Adimian. It's only similar. So Nikra Er Vagili B'Shem Shechina. So that's why the Er Vagili is called Shechina compared to higher levels. Hari Kadei Lias Atzilus B'Chinas Atzilus Ha'elyon. Atzilus should be the Atzilus of the emanations from above. It's not possible without a tzimtzum, first a tzimtzum. Shemitzamtzum b'silik eirei hagodla latzad, that he diminished and so-called the air receded on a side. It's all metaphorical, obviously. Sho'inyas silik eiratz musei. That's the idea that the core energy is removed, or concealed would be the right word. So for Atzilus to be Atzilus, you need a tzimtzum. And then you have the tzimtzum of the kav, which is just a ray. Like think of a teacher who has concealed all his brilliance. And now there's a stream of consciousness, which is just a kav. What's the purpose of this kav? In order to transmit light. The tzimtzum just left an empty space without any revelation. And the kav reintroduced light into the picture, but it's a limited light. The closest like we learned earlier, this light is not to reveal the core essence of the divine. It's to reveal in a way that to radiate in a place where the student can receive, after the tzimtzum, some of the wisdom of the teacher. So that's the removal and the concealment of the core energy. That's the divine infinite energy, which reveals all of him. That is being concealed. And what you're getting is only a limited flow of the kav, to radiate within the tzimtzum, or an example to the student, who, in a way that he can receive it and not be overwhelmed by the infinite light. In Cain. And therefore, based on this, Ikar Shmoi Hu B'chinas Shechina. So this is where the Ikar of where we say Shechina, that's the whole purpose of Shechina. That its name is Shechina, Al Shem Sheshechir Mislabish B'mokim HaMetzumtzum L'Hoyer Reisei. Because that's the whole point of the kav. The point of the kav is that it should be directed and in a way that relates to the makabel, to the kalim, to the recipients. That is the essence of what Shechina is. Like we said before, Tzamtzum Shechinte, V'Shechanti B'Seicham, that it should be directed in a particular location, and here into existence. Im ken yikar shmei b'chinas Shechina, zeh b'makom tzim l'hayir reisei, v'yered u'mishtalshel, and it descends and evolves. Ad shemeir ha'rosei ben shnei badei ha'aron, to the point that its reflection can manifest between the two rods of the ark, like we said, Samtzim Shechinte b'shnei badei ha'aron, u'b'teich kol echad v'echad, v'shechanti b'seicham, within each one of us, though we are finite creatures. Shal zeh nemer v'shechanti b'seicham. And that is what we say, v'shechanti, and I will dwell or rest among you. So now comes a question. If that's the whole point of the kav, so why is the kav not called Shechina? Why we call it kav? Says the Rebbe Rashab, and I'll just read a few more lines and I'll stop for questions. Based on this, the primary name for the kav should have been called Shechina. V'lo nikra b'shem kav. And the only reason it's called kav is only rak kedei sheyuvan inyan tzimtzumei ba'atzmei. It's only to help us understand how you channel it. So if he said Shechina, you wouldn't know how it was channeled. A kav tells you. It's like taking, let's say, a big barrel of wine and then pouring it into channels so it can be contained by smaller pitchers or cups. So that's what the kav tells you. How? Because it's what it's doing is channeling. These are like channel. The kav is a channel that takes this infinite air and is directing it in a limited way. How he actually does it. The same with the teacher. So he concealed all his brilliance, but then he begins to spoon feed. And a flow of consciousness comes from him, which is like a kav. So the kav is actually a visualization of the process. That's, for example, like a kav, a line, and a thread. Shechina would not tell you the process, the way it's done. It would just tell you it's manifesting. Kav tells you the process of how that happens. That it's only a limited flow. But the truth is, kav is only coming to tell you the way it's transmitted. However, the very hamshacha itself, Yikara b'Shechina, is called Shechina. Al Shem, due to the fact that it's Shechin, it resides, it dwells, u'meslabish lahoyer mitech chashekas atzimtzum, that manifests to radiate within the darkness, the concealment of the tzimtzum. This, by the way, is all a quote from the Rebbe Rashab's father, the Rebbe Marash, in Hemshech V'Kocha. So he's really quoting from the Hemshech V'Kocha, is a Hemshech from the Rebbe Marash. Just for the record. Okay. I think I'm going to stop here.
I always thought that Tzimtzum Shechinoso being body ha'orin, this is the Milo from Tzimtzum. This is the holiest place. Atik Beis hazeh
So why does
hashamayim
it say? But the lashon is Tzimtzum Shechinose. It says Tzimtzum.
But Shlomo HaMelech said, "Hashamayim b'shmei hashamayim lo
But the
yechalkelucha."
Maimon Chazal says the word Tzimtzum. How could you say it's not a Tzimtzum?
So what does it mean?
It means exactly what it means. It means that it's not Eid Ein Sof like Lifnei Tzimtzum. It's like a kav that's channeling all that Eid Ein Sof into Ben Shnei Badei Odin, or into existence.
But Beis HaMikdash special Rishon is even higher than everything.
What do you mean? Where does it say that Beis Hamikdash is Eid Ein Sof Lifnei Tzimtzum? It says it's like the kav. That's Mamshech Elikus. The kav is a pretty high level. Why? What? It's coming from Eid Ein Sof. I mean, how do you understand the whole Tzimtzum of the Arizal? Tzimtzum Arishin. So Tzimtzum, the Eid Ein Sof, Lo Hayeh Nesinis Mokim LaElam is Klal, and he created a Tzimtzum, Chol Mokim Ponei, and then was Mamshech Kav into it. Through our Aveda, we could draw more energy down. But initially, you need to create a world, the example of a teacher and a student. The teacher has to conceal his intelligence from the student. And then he could spoon feed him.
So, were you finished, Rabbi Teichtel? Rabbi Teichtel?
Yeah, you can go ahead.
Okay. So, I have a much broader question. Given all these tzimtzumim from from the Makor, which is Atzmus ultimately, and then the Ha'ara of Orin Sof, and so many Madregas down into Biyah, into our lowest worlds. And yet at the same time, we're supposed to make this world a dira for the Eibishter, for Atzmus itself. And the question is the way we do that by Dafka unraveling these series of Tzimtzumim and working our way back up, and saying, like you're saying, it's like Das Elyon, and the way to do it is to appreciate that the Eibishter, from his perspective, there are no Tzimtzumim because he fills everything. From our perspective, we see.
So what's your question? But just like a student and a teacher. The student starts learning Aleph Beis. The goal is to continue to grow, expand our containers, and be able to draw down more and more energy. We're not talking about from God's perspective. We're talking about from our perspective. God didn't need a Tzimtzum. The Tzimtzum is in order to allow, like he said, from Ein Sof and Bli Gvul, how do you get that into Gvul? So the Tzimtzum conceals, like a teacher conceals. Then begins the Avodah of growth, step by step. Thousands of years of our Avodah, Maseinu Avodah, is to refine the material world, expand the containers, to be able to draw down higher and higher levels of Ur.
Of course, I understand that. I that's fundamental. The nature of the Or, to bring Or Ein Sof into this lowest realm, given all these Tzimtzumim, that our perspective on reality cannot tolerate uncontracted light, if you will. And now we understand the light is so contracted because there's so many.
Like the teacher that needs to channel into a child to learn Aleph Beis. That's the best example for that, right?
If Aleph Beis is enough of a Gilui, then yes. But
yes, it is enough for a Gilui because that's the only thing the child can understand.
Exactly.
And then he has to start growing, like all of us go through first grade, second grade, third grade.
The question is a human being capable of growing to the point beyond, let's say, the Kav expression.
This is the whole theme of Ayin Beis. We've learned about it at length. Can a post-Tzimtzum reality come to...
Exactly.
So this is, we talked, you know how many hours I talked about
No, it's the primary theme. Of course, I understand that. I guess what I'm saying is, given that the Rebbe has gone into such minute, or refined detail about all these Tzimtzumim and how it's difficult for such a high level of light to fit into such small kelim. Yes, we can expand our kelim, and we have to
then we grow. We grow and grow.
Yeah, but to the point where we can. That's
the whole point of Ayin Beis. That's what's called the Asad Lave. Mashiach comes, he will have the divine revelation in existence, and each one of us according to our level.
Yeah. I guess the key factor is La'asi Lavo. The Eibishter has to decide.
The key factor is now, actually, La'asi Lavo is just the end of the process.
Right, of course. But the only time that Atzmos itself will be revealed is in La'asi Lavo.
No,
correct?
Not true. That's not correct necessarily. You had Matan Torah, you had Beis HaMikdash, you have Tzadikim, you have people who right now, Eilam Chatir B'chayecha, that have a taste of it.
But that's what Rabbi Taita was just asking about. The Beis HaMikdash, you just made a strong argument for why it's just a Shechina. The Shtei Badim Metzimtzum, I don't have the quote in front of me, but it's contracted. It's Metzimtzum.
So first of all, let's make this clear. There's no Beis HaMikdash today. So that clearly means that it's concealed. Even when there was a Beis HaMikdash, it says Tzamtzum Shechinte. It's not my expression.
Exactly.
Because to be able to channel the divine into one building requires a Tzimtzum. And then comes the Avodah of expanding the channels and ultimately turning the whole world into a home for God.
Yes, of course, I understand that's the mission. I guess I'm wondering if Atzmos couldn't manifest in the Beis HaMikdash and the Kodesh Kedoshim, how can it manifest on my kitchen table?
What is that? I'm not sure what you're asking.
Okay, we just discussed that Shechina, not the Eibishter himself, not Atzmos, was manifested. The Shechina was manifested in the Beis HaMikdash between the Shtei Badei Aron. That's a Shechina. It's not Kudsha Brich Hu.
like the kav. The kav,
Right.
like let's go back to the example. A student can only contain what he can contain. He can't, he'll be overwhelmed by too much light. So it has to come down to a channel that fits into something that he can relate to. That's the Beis Hamikdash. That God chose a place on earth where he channeled his delikus that comes from the highest levels into a particular space and time.
But it's an elikus mitzvah is my only point. But we're sort of
Because
going
everything, that's how God created the world. Everything is tzimtzum until you do avodah. The teacher can only teach aleph beit. Then you have to start expanding to be able. You're talking about the avodah. You're talking about the creation. The creation is through a tzimtzum. Breish is bar lekim.
No, I'm talking about the avoda. I'm talking about
the
bringing
avodah is expanding that the avodah does. Like just like the student grows and grows till he can understand his teacher. At 40 years old, he can understand the depth of his teacher's teaching and even beyond.
And I assume we're getting to Shema, and that's one primary method.
I'm not sure. To me, what you're asking is the very basis of everything. God created the world, and we have to do avodah to do something about it. It's not going to happen automatically.
I fully understand that. I asked a philosophical question. It's almost rhetorical. How we can bring Atzmus, the actual Ma'or,
this is the whole
world.
Theme of Ayin Beis for hundreds of pages, literally.
Yes, I understand that, Rabbi.
So I would just go back to the classes where I discussed it at length, especially in volume 2, where he talks about how do we transform the Tzimtzum and all. That's very much what we're learning now as well, of how we climb and how we expand and how we grow to draw down more energy. What a neshama could do on its own. A neshama needs siyua from Torah, from Einei Ha'eda, like the eye cannot see in the dark, it needs outside support. And then ultimately the eye will grow and develop and be able to see more and more. That's the whole avodah that we need to do. Yeah.
I understand that.
The animal soul on its own, the animal soul, as we learned, does not love God, it loves itself. But through avodah, through Hashem Echad V'Ahavta, you can train it. And that training is a hard work. And that's how you bring more and more godliness into our lives. In the Beis Hamikdash, that's what they did. Adam ki yakriv mekem. They would bring karbonis from the nefesh habamis to allow that elikus to manifest within them.
Yes, I fully understand.
Okay. We're going to stop here because I have to run now. So we'll stop here. Where are we here? Okay.
About 15, 16 lines down. I think you ended
1440. We're in the middle of 1440. Yeah. And we'll continue tomorrow. So I'm going to stop here. I realize I must run. Okay, very bad. Okay.